Philippine National Police. Di ba si Pangulong Duterte? Di sila nagtatago.
One of these days kayong human rights, kayo ang imbestigahin ko. Totoo. Conspiracy. If they are obstructing justice, you shoot them.
Kay Sara Alvarez ay mga death squad ng gobyernong ito.
All the fascists do is to silence citizens, to turn a blind eye, to follow government officials without question. They find pleasure in seeing our people suffer in poverty and in exploitation. They rejoice at seeing a child lose his parents.
Dahil kapag hindi napapanagot ang mga taong ito, lalo silang papatay ng mga mamamayan na nais baguhin ang hindi makataong sitwasyon ng ating mga kababayan dito. Nananawagan po kami sa mamamayan ng buong daigdig para sa iba't ibang paraan ng pagpapanagot. Bahala ho kayo!
Makibaka, huwag matakot.
Bahala ho kayo!
Welcome to everyone tuning in. So grateful for you all to be here tonight. I'm going to turn things over to Jill from Bayan, USA very shortly, but just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Justin from A Growing Culture. We've been working closely with peasant movements in the Philippines for the past year and are just so awed and so privileged to be able to work alongside groups in the peasant struggle in the Philippines. And this is an opportunity to try to bring together a larger collective of folks who want to be a part, of the conversation, who want to find out what they can do to support the movements that are risking their lives every day. As you can see from that video, a farmer killed every 4 days. And that's not just the farmers, we also have the activists and the lawyers and everyone else who is rising up and demanding land and justice has been targeted by the government. And so the necessity for coming together has never been more real. And so that's why we're here and that's why we're hosting this. And I want to turn things over and just excited to be here and excited for what we'll get into in the next few hours. So thank you.
Thank you.
Jill.
Thanks, Justin. So Justin and I are going to be co-emceeing today's conversation. Welcome to Seeding Solidarity, a conversation on the peasant struggle in the Philippines. And I'm Jill Mangaliman. I'm the finance officer of Bayan USA. We're a multi-sectoral alliance of progressive Filipinos or anti-imperialists. We're committed to genuine sovereignty in the Philippines and you know, destroying the problems in our home country of imperialism, U.S. imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism. Today, we're going to be really focused on the feudalism problem in our country, and it's been a long time coming for us to really talk about what does it mean to be in a anti-feudal struggle. What brings us here today, you know, is the issue of land and livelihood and the rights of peasant farmers who are majority of the population in the Philippines. And, you know, they are under attack right now under the US Duterte regime. Just this past week, you know, we heard about the massacres of 3 farmers, peasant indigenous farmers, Angel, Rivas, Levy, and Lenny, and as well as Willie Rodriguez. And you know, it was really very hard news for some of us. We've visited these villages during our expo trips. I've been reflecting on the time when we were allowed to travel to the Philippines and to, you know, see for ourselves the importance of land and the importance that our people back home are you know, their struggles should not be in isolation, that we are here for them and that we're going to continue to fight for them. And I really am thankful to be here with you all. Also, I'm here in Seattle. It's 100 degrees. It's feeling like the Philippines right now. So I'm very, very glad to be here in solidarity with you all and continue to have these conversations on how we can how we can support and ways we can take action. So just some housekeeping rules. We are in a webinar form. So we're gonna keep folks muted, but if you have questions or comments, please put it in the chat. We'll have a Q&A afterwards. And we'll also have a translation. So there is gonna be translation to Spanish, as well as to Tagalog, translation to English. So there'll be prompts when to switch to the interpretation, but just note that if you are in need of translation, that there will be that option, and we'll put in the chat. Maybe we can go to the next slide to show we have an excellent panel of speakers directly from the Philippines. We're going to go through we're going to introduce each one of them as they come up. But yes, thank you so much for being here. And this is also being recorded and live streamed. So without further ado, our first speaker, we're going to hear from Roz Guzman from IBON, which is a research and education institution. And Roz is the executive editor and head of research for IBON. And IBON is a nonprofit development organization that's been serving the Filipino people through research and education since 1978. Yes, let's turn it over to Roz to hear about the national situation.
Thank you very much, Jill. Good day, everyone. IBON has one message for this this time of the year that we give our national situation. It's already just a few weeks before the president's last State of the Nation address, and we're not really seeing a bright horizon at this point. I have one simple message for this for today's discussion, and that is the Duterte government's bungled pandemic response caused severe economic crisis, and that will make the leadership transition. As you may know, 2022 is our election year, and it's going to be a difficult leadership transition. So that's my message. How bungled is COVID response? We have cumulative 1.4 million infections, which is second only to Indonesia. But we are ahead of Indonesia in terms of the number of confirmed cases on a 7-day rolling average relative to population. Our positivity rate remains high at 11.7% when it should be 5%. And that is the threshold in order for our government to ease restrictions. But we never reached that threshold. It's always higher than that. And this is simply because we are not testing enough. When you look at our curve, apparently we were still on the second wave last April, the first wave being in August 2020. This is despite the Philippines having one of the longest and strictest lockdowns in the world. We were put under different variations of community quarantines beginning on March 15, 2020. We have the enhanced community quarantine, or ECQ. Then it became MECQ, which is the modified ECQ, and then GCQ, which is the general community quarantine. Now we have this thing called GCQ with restrictions. And the running sarcasm is among us is we are actually under NECQ, which is the never-ending community quarantine. And now the government calls the National Capital Region the bubble, and the general rule is simply to stay inside the bubble. How bungled is the response? If we were in a chess game, the Duterte government's opening and middle game have both been incompetent. It refused to impose a travel ban, especially on those coming from China in the beginning, and falsely insisted that the government did not have to do it because We would not be affected by COVID because the public health system and the economy were strong. Then, as its middle game, it has continued to refuse to do proper testing. We are still at the level of 50,000 tested individuals per day, when we should be at 180,000 tested individuals by now to achieve a 5% positivity rate. Contact tracing ratio remains at 1:3, which means 1 infected to 3 contacts, when we should already be at 1:37 for proper containment. The hospitals are overwhelmed, while the government has not assigned or built enough quarantine facilities. And now its end game is vaccination. How bad is that? We need to vaccinate 70 million Filipinos, or 140 million doses, to achieve herd immunity. Only 6.68 million Filipinos so far have received at least 1 dose. Or if we count the doses, we have only done 8.93 million doses, which is at a rate of 62,000, more or less, per day, doses per day. So you keep that rate. If kept at that rate, the Duterte government would only be able to administer an additional 11.9 million doses by the end of the year, and would take another 5 years to complete doses for 70 million Filipinos. The Duterte government has been irrational and unscientific, or if I may say, anti-science even, in its approach to the pandemic, and instead employed a militaristic response. Instead of properly testing and contact tracing, it deployed its military troops to close and check the borders, control the population, apprehend so-called violators, penalize them, and put them in cramped jails. The government set up a national task force mainly composed of and headed by former military generals. It also assigned military generals in key positions for pandemic response and called them czars, for instance, on tracing and vaccination. So-called czars on testing, treatment, and isolation are civilians, but the head of the Build Infrastructure program was assigned for testing, a health official for treatment, and the head of the public works, who is the son of the real estate magnate, the Villar family, for isolation facilities. The Duterte government over-relied on militarist lockdowns without strengthening the health system and how the people would cope with the economic aftermath. It has been incredibly niggardly or stingy. At the height of the lockdown last year, its economic aid, which we call ayuda, amounted to only about 19 cents per person per day. Reluctantly, it extended the social amelioration program, worth $5 billion in 2020, to a token of $464 million only in 2021. We still need an accounting of these amounts, as apparently some portions are still unspent. The government even underspent at the time of a pandemic. The increase in government spending in 2020 was even lower than the annual average increase in government spending. It was even lower than the increase in 2019. And then the projected increase in spending for 2021 is even lower than the spending in 2022. I'm sorry, in 2020, the increase in spending. The Philippines is among the stingiest COVID fiscal response in the region, ranking 7th among the 10 ASEAN members, with only Brunei, Laos, and Myanmar below it. It has the weakest economic response among the ASEAN, despite being flaunted by credit rating agencies as being financially strong. And it is among the weakest health response in the world, ranking 65th in 91 countries. The Philippine economy, already slowing down 3 years in a row, finally collapsed in 2020, the worst collapse on record, which is to say since the Second World War, which is only when the GDP started to be estimated for the country. You know, the Duterte administration has a false binary. It insists that it was a choice between health and the economy, kalusugan or kabuhayan. And portrayed itself as having agonized, the president crying on national TV, but made the difficult choice to prioritize health. So that's the whole big time drama. and the economic collapse was just the price to pay, the government is saying. But that is a false choice. Both could have been attended too well, as the experiences of Vietnam and Thailand have shown. And it's also not really the choice the Duterte administration made in terms of pandemic response. The choice it made was the militarist one, to treat the people as the enemy and to rely on harsh lockdowns and long community quarantines. Lockdowns, long and irrational, those are the ones that caused the worst economic collapse in Philippine history. And also in the middle of a pandemic and the suffering of tens of millions of Filipinos, the Duterte government has chosen to prioritize creditworthiness over spending to contain the pandemic. It has prioritized infrastructure projects over health and agriculture. It has prioritized making the economy still attractive to foreign investors over aiding to boost consumption. And finally, at the height of the pandemic, the Duterte government passed the law to give corporate income tax cuts to corporations and to rich individuals. National government outstanding debt stands at 10 trillion pesos. The administration increased its gross borrowings 3 times in 2020. So that's 3 trillion pesos in that year, but only about 3% of that amount went to COVID response. Simply, the government borrowed so much to reaffirm its creditworthiness. There's money for infrastructure, 1.1 trillion. For debt servicing, there's 1.8 trillion. And even for the military, that is only almost equal as the budget for health, but definitely larger than the budget for agriculture. There is even budget for the National Task Force to end local communist armed conflict and intelligence funds. That is even bigger than this year's ayuda. The Philippines has the worst economic contraction among 22 countries in South, East, and Southeast Asia. And this is simply because the Duterte administration made the wrong choices. The country's jobs crisis has reached its worst under lockdown, with almost 1/3 of the labor force either unemployed or underemployed. And this has reached its worst under the long COVID lockdown. Informal self-employment, that is the kind of employment that is most prevalent in the country. There's a drop in the number of wage and salary workers, which is the formal employment, which is an indicator of job losses in establishments such as micro, small, and medium enterprises that closed down during the lockdown. But there is a rise in self-employed and unpaid family workers. People are forced into self-employed work without any paid employees or becoming unpaid family workers in family farms or business. In terms of number of hours worked, there are now almost as many part-time workers plus those with a job but not at work as the full-time workers. So in Filipino, we are saying this, gumagawa ng paraan, or they're making do with whatever employment or means of earning an income is there. Or we even call it sariling sikap, which is the Filipino colloquial version of what you call self-employed without paid employees. So that is now those are the kinds of jobs that are most prevalent now in the economy. In fact, the most recent ECQ in March 2021, for instance, it caused a 2.1 million drop in total employment between March and April. And in April, the government reported a minimal increase in employment. And the government was saying, we recovered employment, we recovered jobs, but a closer look shows very poor quality work is being generated. People are crowding into sectors that are notoriously low paying and irregular, such as trade, retail trade, and agriculture. But when you look at the GDP, these are the same sectors that contracted in the same period, which strongly implies that lower sectoral incomes are made worse by overcrowding. So the workers here, the farmers and the farm workers are being underpriced or undervalued because of overcrowding, too many labor supply, therefore too low price for labor. And we are not even talking about overseas migrant workers losing their jobs abroad, coming home, or not being called for contract renewal. This kind of labor and economy situation has set the basis for the cheapening of labor power. The government pegs the minimum wage at an atrociously low standard of living and poverty threshold of only about $1.50 a day. The daily minimum wage in the National Capital Region is only about 47% of the amount that IBON estimates a family of 5 needs to survive. The lockdowns have worsened this. There were 15 million or 62.1% of Filipino families that went hungry and 18.6 million households in distress and without savings in the entire year of 2020. The government has clearly sided with the super rich. Just so we have an idea of how wide this gap is, the richest 500 families earn 6.7 million pesos a day, while the poorest 12.4 million families earn 11,250 pesos a day. Or maybe you can say in 2019, the 4.1 trillion pesos net worth of the 50 richest Filipinos who ended up in the Forbes list was equal to the combined earnings of the poorest 60 to 70 thousand Filipino families. Yet at the height of the pandemic, as the poor were losing incomes, the Duterte government even gave the economic oligarchs reduction in corporate income taxes and prioritized the continuation of infrastructure and real estate construction, which are the sources of wealth of the country's economic oligarchs. The Duterte administration just went on heightening, intensifying the implementation of neoliberal policies. It reopened mining, renewed the concession agreement for privatized water services. It opened up the remaining sectors of the economy that are close to foreign investment and ownership. The last one it did by amending the Philippine Constitution. The Duterte government opened up media and advertising, education, public utilities, and the public domain, such as land, to foreign ownership. Duterte's economic managers continue to sell the foreign investment myth, that the country is too restrictive. That is why it is not getting enough foreign direct investment, or FDI, for it to recover and develop fast. This is not true at all. We have the lowest FDI in the region as percent of GDP, but this does not have anything to do with our restrictiveness. Indonesia is as restrictive as the Philippines, but Indonesia has 5 times larger FDI inflows. It is also not true that Taiwan and South Korea, for example, or even China, industrialized due to FDI, or foreign direct investment. At the time they were industrializing, their FDI as percent of their capital formation or even GDP was small. So they had efficiently used FDI when they were already stable and had reached a respectable level of development. On the contrary, for the Philippines, at the peak of FDI inflows, we have witnessed the erosion of our agriculture and manufacturing sectors and the worst jobs crisis, which has even gotten worse by now. Strategic industries or corporations in the Philippines, they are not leaving the country because we are too restrictive, but precisely because we are not regulating foreign investment well enough. So the best way to get the economy out of the pandemic shock is to propel it to recovery, is for government to spend on boosting aggregate demand. That is the best way. And even the US or even EU governments have seen this, that the best way to recover their economies is to boost aggregate demand, to give wage subsidies, to give enough economic relief and economic stimulus. And this is what Duterte's economic managers refuse to see. Neoliberalism has long been discredited. In fact, there are more protectionist policies being reinforced worldwide now than liberalization policies. Yet the Duterte administration continues to cling on to this bankrupt belief system. It continues to express this belief by making infrastructure its centerpiece program, or what we call build, build, build. Infrastructure attracts foreign capital. It pleases foreign business, such as trade and the global value chains. It enriches domestic oligarchic families, especially those in real estate business. And it serves China's aggression in the region. Of course, it lines the pockets of public officials. The reason for this pro-oligarchs and pro-foreign, and at the same time, self-serving. Those are the reasons. I would like to please the oligarchs. I'd like to please the foreign business. But at the same time, it's for me, it's self-serving, because only by boosting foreign and domestic oligarchs' control of the Philippine economy through neoliberalism, despite the obviously harsh impact on the population, only through that can a president stay in power at this point, which is what Duterte wants. Duterte has strengthened his own set of cronies, has increased crony wealth by favorable neoliberal policies, and has accumulated his own wealth in only 5 years. This has been made possible through tyrannical rule, first by increasing the salaries of all armed personnel, putting generals in the bureaucracy, in the civilian bureaucracy, silencing and neutralizing opposition, and targeting the left through relentless vilification, red tagging, and trumped-up cases. It has all been surgical, very methodical, beginning with his declaration of a war on drugs to establish his authoritarian credentials, and moving on with having a so-called whole-of-nation approach to run a de facto martial rule. 2022 will be our election year. Elections in the Philippines is just a semblance of democracy. But 2022 will be worst among the pretensions we have seen so far. Duterte wants to extend his rule beyond 2022. Aside from wanting to continue enriching his family, there is also the urgency to avoid accountability for crimes against humanity that the International Criminal Court has already ordered to be investigated. This early, the administration is already floating incredible survey results of his popularity. Duterte's preferred candidates, including his notorious and vain daughter, and others who have individual political ambitions, will have to get the crony and oligarch support. They have ready-made local alliances, political alliances on the ground, and the advantage of having the equity of the incumbent if that remains credible. But most importantly, they are closest to the electoral war chest, the national coffers at their disposal. So maybe we should end with a question. What are the chances of the unified opposition? Well, first of all, they will have to be unified under only one goal, and that is to end Duterte's tyrannical rule and replace it with a democratic and sane governance. In a short period, the opposition has to establish its machinery and winnability. Take note, we are not talking about platforms and programs here. As you can see, you can win the presidency in this country, even if you do not have a good platform. Duterte, case in point. The incumbent has been using systematic, massive disinformation using social media, as well as repression to remain in power. It will use the pandemic conditions, including vaccination, to heighten this, not surprisingly into electoral fraud and violence just to get what it wants. Last question, how strong is the people's movement to thwart these political ambitions, to end Duterte's rule? I leave that for the open discussion, but it is enough to say that the economic crisis is so severe to cover up with empty electoral promises. Thank you, good day.
Thank you, Ross, for that that's political situationer, laying out just the facts why why we can't stand another 5 years of Duterte. We have to, like you said, end his regime right away. And that's why also Bayan USA we support the Duterte Wakasan Na movement to end Duterte's regime by any means possible, whether it's resign, elections, or ouster, or forcing him to be impeached. We can't, again, his attacks on the people are way too great, and we can't afford any more and more of his regime. And yeah, thank you again, IBON, for laying that out, and his failure to to respond to the COVID pandemic, and continually, our people continue to suffer. We're going to switch over to a cultural break we have an offering up from SINAGBAYAN, which is an organization of cultural workers, theater artists, poets, musicians, writers, and visual artists, creating and popularizing people's arts and literature. And so this piece, If the Land Could Speak, is a poem from the Cordilleras, which was first made into a dance by SINAGBAYAN for the WTO protest in Hong Kong in 2005. It was later translated to Filipino as part of the dance theater production Pintong Sondang in 2012. This dance piece takes different form and breathes different choreography every time it is rendered by new SINAGBAYAN artists. And this video that we're going to show is the performance in the launching of Jeja, or Justice for Echanes, Justice for All. It features new members from Metro Manila communities who were trained by SINAGBAYAN for the Escalante massacre commemoration in September 2020. So let's show this video from SINAGBAYAN.
Nagsasalita ang lupa. Magsasalita ito para sa atin. Sa matagal na panahon, niyakap nito ang pag-aaruga ng ating mga kamay at pinagyabong ang mga binhing ating itinanim sa kanyang sinapupunan. Pero sino ang makikinig? Mabait ang lupa. Wala itong malay at hindi mapangmata. Hindi itinatanong kung sino tayo noong tayo ay dumating sa kanya. Kagaya natin, ang lupa ay walang malay sa kapangyarihang taglay ng isang pirasong papel na dala ng makapangyarihan. Mga taong may kakayahang pumatay, mga taong may kakayahang agawin sa atin ang lahat, ang ating asawa, ang ating anak. Kung nagsasalita ang lupa, magsasalita ito para sa atin. Sasabihin itong daang taon na ang nagdurugtong sa ating mga puso't sa kanyang sinapupunan. Ang ating pagpapagal ang nag-aruga sa kanya, at ang kanyang mga supling ay bumubuhay sa atin. Tayo at ang lupa ay iisa. Makikinig ba silang mga nakahilata sa kastilyo ng ating pagpapakasakit? Sino ang nagsabi sa kanila na ang lupa, dahil nakasulat ito sa papel? Papel na dala ng makapangyarihan, mga taong may kakayahang pumatay, mga taong may kakayahang agawin sa atin, ang ating mga asawa, ang ating mga anak. Kung nagsasalita ang lupa, magsasalita ito para sa atin. Dahil tayo at ang lupa ay iisa. At tayo ngayon ay nagsasalita.
Thank you so much for that. Much love to SINAGBAYAN for putting that together, and just incredible. I think that it belies the point that you can't, that so much of what's going on right now as the Duterte regime is waging a war against the Filipino people is that it's so much a cultural war as well. And it's so important to recognize the role of cultural movements like SINAGBAYAN, who are bringing art and breathing life into the movements in different ways through creative energy. And I think uniting people around ways to express that connection to the land that often comes up in violence, that so much of that connection to the land right now is tainted by blood because of the government's repression. And so I think to reclaim that connection and to recognize that at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. This is fighting for land. It's so important to have that positive connection and that positive side as well. And I see somebody ask me if there's going to be a link to that video. We'll make sure that people get access. I now want to usher in a movement that has been at the forefront of the fight for land and justice, and who I've had the privilege of being able to work in support and service to. So next up, we're going to have Danilo Ramos Kadaning from KMP, and he will be discussing what the history of genuine agrarian reform has been, the struggle for land, and what the human rights violations that the government has perpetrated against people who have been advocating for their right to land. So Kadaning, please, we turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. Seeding solidarity. Peasant struggle for land and justice. Magandang umaga, magandang gabi sa lahat. Mula sa peasant movement, justisya, ipaglaban. Magbubukid at mamamayan, magkaisa. Isulong ang tunay na reforma sa lupa at pambansang industrialisasyon. Maraming salamat sa AGC at compatriots sa North America at iba't ibang panig ng bansa. On behalf of KMP, warm greetings of solidarity to all. I'm Danilo Ramos, a rice farmer from the province of Bulacan, Central Luzon, chairperson of KMP. It's my honor and privilege to speak to this important webinar. KMP was founded on July 1985. Since then, our organization is at the forefront of the Filipino peasant struggle for genuine agrarian reform. It upholds the national democratic interests of millions of rural poor in the countryside, fights against oppressive local landlord, big bourgeoisie, and the exploitative feudal and feudal condition that perpetuate the lingering social inequality and injustice suffered by the Filipino people. The KMP and its 15 regional and 65 provincial chapters with more than 2 million members throughout the country are unwavering leading farmers, seasonal farm workers, and millions of rural poor in the countryside. We struggle for genuine land reform with free land distribution, mainly for the poor farmers, farm workers, and those who are willing to till the lands. National industrialization that promotes national industries that will provide domestic employment, pave the way for agricultural and industrial development. KMP carry out painstaking organizing, education, and mobilizing work among the peasants in building a strong peasant movement. We also struggle for immediate economic relief for toiling masses and landless initiatives, programs, and projects such as organic farming and ecological agriculture, livelihood and production, disaster relief and rehabilitation, and also sama-samang bungkalan at naglulunsad ng bagsakan kung saan sama-samang ibinebenta ang produkto ng magsasaka at para na rin sa pakinabangan ng taong bayan. A sovereign nation that is independent of foreign control and domination, justice to all victims of human rights abuses, extrajudicial killings perpetuated by the security forces of the Duterte regime, including victims of red tagging and criminalization of agrarian cases, fake and forced surrenderies. Magsasaka kami, hindi terorista. We till the land and produce food for all. Sa ilalim ng rehimeng US-China Duterte, hindi na nga ipinapamahagi ang lupa sa magsasaka at napakaliit na tulong sa panahon ng pandemya at sunod-sunod na kalamidad sa bansa, inaresto pa, ikinukulong at pinapaslang at minamasakir ng tanggol magsasaka mula nang maupo si Duterte hanggang sa kasalukuyan. 362 magbubukid, mangingisda at manggagawang agrikultural ang biktima ng rehimen mula ng maluklok sa pwesto. Duterte is massacre king. Sa halip na tulong at ayuda para sa magsasaka, mangingisda at manggagawang agrikultural, panunupil at pamamaslang ang tugon ng pamahalaan. Tampok dito ang Sagay 9 Massacre sa Negros, October 2018, Tumandok 9 Massacre sa Isla ng Panay noong December 2020, at brutal na pagpaslang sa leader ng KMP at anak pawis tulad ni Carandal Etchanis, Joseph Canlas, at mga leader manggagawa tulad ni Dandy Miguel. Si Pangulong Duterte ay peste sa magsasaka, salot sa masa. State policy of red tagging that leads to extrajudicial killings and extrajudicial killings justified by the red tagging of its defenseless victims. Dapat nang wakasan ang virus sa Malacanang. Kaya matinding inaatake ng Armed Forces of the Philippines, Philippine National Police at Security Forces ang magsasaka at katutubong mamamayan sa kanayunan. Iginigiit namin, iginigiit nito ang karapatan sa lupa, nilalabanan ng land grabbing at mga kontra mamamayang proyekto para sa interes ng malalaking burgesa komprador na kroni ni Pangulong Duterte at mga makadayuhang build. Hindi titigil ang nakikibakang magbubukid at mamamayan. Ibayo pang magpupursigi sa pagkilos para sa tunay na pagbabago. Marangal ang gawain at simulain ng kilusang mapagpala sa Pilipinas. Para sa interes ng mamamayan at future generations, ang mga lehitimo at makatarungang panawagan ng magbubukid, lupa at ayuda, hindi ang tsa-tsa or chartered chains, 10,000 pesos cash aid and 15,000 production subsidy, mainly for land preparation, seeds, and fertilizer. Implement genuine land reform, land to the tillers, not for the landlord and agribusiness corporations. Not comprehensive agrarian reform program, CARP, and phase 2, and split parcelization of land initiated by the Department of Agrarian Reform. Enact genuine agrarian reform bill o GARB or House Bill 239 submitted by the Makabayan Bloc in 18th Congress. Paunlarin ang lokal na produksyon ng pagkain ng bansa, lalo na ang bigas, isda, gulay at karne, hindi importasyon. Take agriculture out of WTO, junk neoliberalism, stop killing farmers. Justice for all victims of state terrorism, scrap Memorandum Order Number 32, oppose Anti-Terrorism Act and implementing rules and regulation. Immediate release of political prisoners, buwagin ang NTF-ELCAC. Makibaka, huwag matakot, kumilos at magtagumpay. Mabuhay ang masang anak pawis, mabuhay ang nakikibakang mamamayan. Muli, maraming salamat sa lahat ng kabahagi ng webinar na ito at mabuhay kayo. Lastly, nais kong bigkasin ang tula na isinulat ko sa piling ng mga kababayan natin sa Italy noong Enero 2009 na may kaugnayan sa ating panawagang tunay na reforma sa lupa, pambansang industrialisasyon, land and justice. Narito po ang isinulat ng inyong lingkod na naging bahagi sa umanito, mga likhang sining ng buhay at pakikibaka ng magsasaka para sa lupa at kalayaan. Lupa at migrasyon. Kawalan, hirapan ang nagtulak para mga ibang bayan. Lupaing dinawag at nilinang ng kalyuhing kamay, inaruga gabit araw, lupang pinagyaman, tinangkin at kinamkam ng Panginoong may lupang gahaman. Ang malawak na bukirin at plantasyon, dayuhan ng nagkamal. Panginoong may lupa ang dominante sa kanayunan. Pidal at malapidal ang pagsasamantala sa kanayunan, nagpatuloy at tumindi pa. Atrasadong agrikultura at sistema ng pagsasaka, export-oriented na katangian ng ekonomiya at foreign-dominated pa. Kaya paluba ang krisis na dinaranas ng mamamayan. Nakitang solusyon ang mga ibang bayan, nilisan ng pamilya at bayang sinilangan. Nakipagsapalaran sa Italia, Amerika at gitnang silangan. Pumasok na katulong, alipin ang turing ng mga dayuhan, nilapastangan ang natatangal ng kababaihan. 1, 2 taon ang lumipas, inabot ng 3 dekada. Bakit walang tunay na kaunlaran ng bayang sinilangan? Susi at mahalagang solusyon sa krisis at kahirapan, tunay na reforma sa lupa at pambansang kaunlaran. Paunlarin ng agrikultura at masang anak pawis. Ito ang dapat ipatupad ng gobyernong tunay na nagmamahal sa bayan. Dominasyon ng dayuhan at makaisang panig na kasunduan, itigil at wakasan. Magsasaka at migranteng Pilipino, pahigpitin ang pagkakaisa. Sama-sama nating ipaglaban ang karapatang mabuhay ng marangal, lupa, nakabubuhay na sahod, trabaho at karapatan ipaglaban. Darating ang araw, magagapin natin ang mapang-api at mapagsamantala. Makakamta natin ang bukang liwayway, ang tunay na kalayaan ng inang bayan. Salamat po at mabuhay kayo.
Thank you so much, Kadaning. Always appreciate your words and your strength. Makibaka huwag matako. And I think we got a short video to just give you guys a bit of a sense about KMP. Adrian, if you could cue that, and then we'll turn it over to the next section.
semen. I guarantee you it'll be your very last time breathing. You could put your whole army against my semen. I guarantee you it'll be your very last time breathing.
Thank you, Kadaning and KMP for your tireless leading of the peasant movement. I think I mentioned earlier that the majority of the Philippine population is, are landless peasants. That's 75% of the population, and these are the people who are basically providing the food and agriculture for the country and the world. And the way that Duterte repays them is through attacks and murders and terror tagging, and calling them terrorists. And, we know that the real terrorist is Duterte himself. He's the one who's causing the terror. And we have to really stand up and expose what he's doing. And so justice for Joseph Canles, justice for Randy Echanes, the leaders of the peasant movement that we've lost over the last year, and keep fighting, and keep fighting and moving forward. Now we're going to hear not just about the peasant situation, but now we're going to hear about the situation about fisherfolk. The Philippines is, as we know, is rich in resources, agriculturally, but also in biodiversity. And another way of livelihood has the peasants is through fishing. And so we'll hear from Fernando Hiccup from Pamalakaya, the National Federation of Small Fisherfolk Organizations in the Philippines. Fernando is the chairperson and is a former Anacapawis congressman with at least 100,000 individual members across the archipelago. Pamalakaya unites small fisher folks in the struggle for genuine fishery reform and basic rights. And then we're also going to have an interpretation switch, so if tech folks can do so. But yes, Fernando, you're up.
Yes, magandang umaga. Good morning, everyone. Naririnig po ako.
Yes,
Okay, maraming
Kapando,
salamat.
malinaw.
Malinaw. Okay, maraming salamat sa pag-imbita sa Pamalakaya, Pilipinas para maging bahagi sa napakahalagang webinar para sa sharing ng pakikbakan ng mga magsasaka sa ating bansa. But in particular, topic for me is about the West Philippine Sea on sovereignty and impact of the fisherfolks and the fishing ground in the Philippines of the Chinese government reclamation and West Philippine Sea. Ngayong July 12, ngayong taon ay ika-5 taon ng makasaysayan na decision ng arbitral ruling ng The Hague kaugnay doon sa disputed area sa West Philippine Sea ng China at ng Pilipinas, na kung saan ay ibinasura ng tribunal ang claim ng China na 9-dash line, na ito ay walang batayan at walang historic ang kanilang pagigiit na ang halos 80% ng West Philippine Sea ay sasaklawin ng 9-dash line ng China. Subalit sa loob ng halos 5 taon ng tagumpay na ito ay nananatili ang presensya at okupasyon at nagpapalawak ng mga reklamasyon ang gobyerno ng China dyan sa West Philippine Sea. At sa ngayon ay aabot na sa 16,000 hektarya ng ating coral reefs ang tinambakan ng China para tayuan ng base militar ng China dyan sa West Philippine Sea. Naitayo na nila ang 7 isla at sinaklaw at nasa kontrol nila ang 7 isla dyan, yung Kagitingan Reef, Panganiban, Zamora, Calderon, Johnson, and others island. No? At nananatili ang presensya ng mga Chinese Coast Guard at militia, Chinese militia dyan sa West Philippine Sea. At katunayan, last April 2020 ay itinayo ng gobyerno ng China ang 2 administrative district dyan sa West Philippine Sea sa ilalim ng Shaanxi City o probinsya ng Hainan. No? Ito yung Xisha District na kung saan ay sakop nito ang Panatag Shoal, no? Yung Kalayaan Group of Island na tinawag nila na Yongyan daw. At ang pangalawang distrito na itinayo dyan ay pinangalanan nila na Nasya District. No? Ang saklaw naman nito ay yung bahagi ng Scarborough o Kalayaan Panatag Shoal, no? Na pinakamalapit dyan sa Zambales, no? Dito sa mainland ng Central Luzon. At nananatili ang 2 Chinese Coast Guard sa bunganga ng lagon ng Scarborough at hindi pinapayagan ang mga mangingisdang Pilipino na makapasok doon sa lagon na kung saan ay dati bago nawala ang occupation ng China dyan sa West Philippine Sea ay ito yung taguan o safety area ng mga mangingisdang Pilipino kapag inaabot ng masamang panahon o bagyo dyan sa West Philippine Sea. Sa ngayon ay hindi na nagagawa ng mga Pilipino na pumasok doon sa lagon ng Scarborough dahil pinagbabawalan na ng mga Chinese Coast Guard kaya napipilitan na umuwi sa mainland ang mga mangingisdang Pilipino kay marami na pong mga report, no? Na maraming mangingisdang Pilipino na inaabot ng malakas na bagyo diyan sa gitna ng dagat at nalulunod kaya merong mga namamatay, no? At ngayon, ngayong January ng taong ito ay nagbalangkas ng isang tinatawag ang gobyerno ng China ng tinatawag na Coast Guard Law, no? Na kung saan ay inaatasan ang mga Chinese Coast Guard na barilin ang sino man na mga foreign fishing vessel at vessel pasok diyan sa kanilang territorial water. Nakakabahala po ito on the part ng mga mangingisdang Pilipino dahil nga po doon sa 80% ng West Philippine Sea ay nananatili na sa control, no? Ng China dahil doon sa kawalan, no? Kaya nangyayari ito dahil doon sa hindi kinilala ni Pangulong Duterte itong mahalagang tagumpay natin na desisyon ng arbitral ruling noong 2016 at binibigyan pa ng sa mga statement ni Pangulong Duterte, binibigyan ng pagkilala na mayroong karapatan ang presensya ng mga China diyan sa West Philippine Sea kaya napaka-agresibo, no? At kawalan ng pagrespeto ng mga commercial fishing vessel ng China sa mga mangingisdang Pilipino. Kasi na po na naging karanasan natin diyan 2 taon na, no? Nakalipas yung binangga yung Number 1, yung isang pangisdaan o bangka ng mga mangingisdang Pilipino sa Mindoro ng isang Chinese commercial fishing vessel, no? At imbis na tulungan ni Pangulong Duterte yung mga mangingisdang Pilipino kundi inabsulto pa, no? yung Chinese commercial fishing vessel na bumangga sa kanila dahil lang sa statement na ito ay simpleng maritime incident lamang. No? Kaya hanggang ngayon, wala pa pong katarungan yan. At nararanasan ng mga mangingisdang Pilipino yung mga mula noon hanggang ngayon, no? Yung harassment ng mga Chinese Coast Guard, yung sa pilitang inaakyat yung kanilang mga bangka at kinukuha yung mga kanilang mga huli, at mayroon pang pagkakataon kahit yung gamit nila sa pangisda, no, ay kinukuha ng mga Chinese Coast Guard. Kaya dahil dito, no, based sa mga pag-aaral ng mga siyentista, yung epekto nito, no, sa pangisdaan, yung reklamasyon na 16,000 hektarya ng 7 island na ngayon ay base militar na ng China, ang katumbas nito, no, ay aabot sa 1.92 trillion pesos. Ganun po kalaki, no? At dahil sa present ng mga Chinese commercial fishing vessel diyan sa West Philippine Sea, sa estimate ng National Task Force on West Philippine Sea, aabot sa 240,000 metric tons ng isda ang nahuhuli ng mga Chinese commercial fishing vessel araw-araw diyan sa West Philippine Sea. At bumagsak, ano, dahil dito ay bumagsak ng 70% ang huli ng mga mangingisdang Pilipino diyan na yung mga nangingisda diyan sa West Philippine Sea. At ayon mismo sa National Task Force on West Philippine Sea, aabot sa 627,000 na mga mangingisdang Pilipino ang nawalan ng kabuhayan. At ngayon ang Pilipinas ay taon-taon ay nag-i-import na ng galunggong, no? Na dati-rati ay nag-export tayo ng isda, ngayon ang Pilipinas ay importer na ng galunggong. Dahil sa 80% ng galunggong ng supply ng Pilipinas ay galing sa West Philippine Sea, na yun ay hindi na nahuhuli ng mga mangingisdang Pilipino, at ang naghuhuli nito ay yung mga mangingisdang China, at tayo ay taon-taon na nag-i-import na ng galunggong sa China. Kaya sa kabuuan, no, na-estimate ng mga siyentista, itong ginagawa ng China na reklamasyon at mga mapanirang paraan ng panghuhuli ng isda tulad ng mga troll at saka yung pagwasak ng mga coral reefs dyan, at saka yung pagkuha ng mga endangered species, no? Even yung mga clam o yung mga taklubo, no, ay hindi pinapalagpas ng mga Chinese fishermen. At ayon sa datos ng mga ekonomista at siyentista, aabot sa 33 billion pesos taon-taon ang nawawala sa kita na dapat ay para sa Pilipinas. Kaya ang mahalaga, no, napakahalaga ang West Philippine Sea sa ating bansa, sa Filipino fisherman at sa ating bansa, dahil 20% ng supply ng isda sa Pilipinas ay galing sa West Philippine Sea. At kung bakit mayaman at maraming isda na nahuhuli dito sa bahagi ng Zambales, dito sa Southern Tagalog, part ng Palawan, part ng Cavite, even dito sa Manila Bay, ay dahil dyan sa napakayamang corals na naging breeding ground, no, ng mga isda ang West Philippine Sea. Kaya para sa amin po ay dapat ay bawiin ang West Philippine Sea. Walang batayan, walang legal o batas na nagbibigay ng karapatan sa China na ariin at kontrolin ang West Philippine Sea. Ang ginagawa nila ay malinaw na ito ay labag sa konstitusyon ng ating bansa. Ito ay malinaw na pagdarambong ng ating patrimonya, no? At soberanya bilang paglabag sa soberanya ng ating bansa. Kaya ang panawagan natin ng Pamalakaya Pilipinas at ang kailangan natin ay rehabilitation, no, ng pangisdaan, hindi po destruction, at para matiyak natin na ang pangisdaan ng Pilipinas ay para sa mamayang Pilipino, hindi para sa dayuhan, no? Kaya ang panawagan natin, atin ang Pinas, China layas. Muli po, magandang umaga sa atin lahat.
Thank you, Sama. Yeah, this has been very helpful to hear about the Fishefolk struggle. And yes, if you haven't already, please, you can support by signing on to the unity statement that was released during Independence to to help defend Fisherfolk from Chinese imperialism, and it's in the link right there. So our next speaker is Zenaida Soriano from Amihan, the National Federation of Peasant Women, to give a perspective of peasant women. Zenaida is the chairperson, and Amihan is working towards genuine agrarian reform, national industrialization, and an end to all forms of exploitation and discrimination, especially against women in the countryside. Okay, I'll pass it to you, Zenaida.
Magandang umaga at magandang gabi sa mga kababayan natin at sa lahat ng mga mamamayan sa US at Canada. Bilang babae, ang nabanggit ng mga unang naging tagapagsalita, ang KMP at ang Pamalakaya, ang dinaranas nila ay dinaranas din ng mga kababaihang magbubukid o kababaihang pisante. Para sa amin, ang kababaihang pisante ay ang mga kababaihang magsasaka, mga manggagawang bukid at manggagawang bukid, gayon din yung mga agricultural workers na kababaihan sa mga plantasyon at hacienda, ang mga mangingisdang kababaihan at ang mga indigenous women. Yun ang aming, yun yung aming tinatawag na mga pesanteng kababaihan. Na kung saan ay dumaranas ng dobleng aping pagsasamantala, pang-aapi at pagsasamantala na dahilan sa ating feudal at semi-feudal, yung feudal exploitation na nararanasan ng mga mamamayang Pilipino. Kaya para sa ang mga kababaihang, mga magbubukid ay hindi kinikilala ang kanilang mahalagang papel at partisipasyon sa pagsasaka. Sinabi ko nga sa mga, pag may speaking engagement ako, tinatanong ko, paano nyo napipicturize pag sinabing magsasaka? Nakikita ba ninyo ang mga babae? At marami ang hindi nakaka-recognize talaga. Ang iniisip nila, ang mga babae, ay pantulong lamang sa kanilang mga asawa. Pero sa totoo lang, malaking bahagi ng trabaho sa bukid ay ginagampanan ng mga babae. Lalo na sa mga palayan at mga maisan at gulayan na kung saan ay after land preparation ay ang mga babae na ang magte-take over dahil ang mga kalalakihan, dahil kapos nga ang kita, ay kailangan maghanap na ng ibang hanap buhay doon sa tulad ng construction worker, maging driver at mga kung ano pang mga odd jobs na kinakailangan. Kung kaya't ang mga kababaihan ang naiiwan sa kanilang tahanan, sa bukid at sa lahat ng mga pangangailangan. So nakatali ang mga kababaihan. Sabi nga namin, kung si President Duterte may build, ang mga kababaihan ay nakatali rin sa maraming no? Nakatali sa bahay, sa bata, sa bana, yung asawa, sa usapin ng mga Bisaya, sa tawag ng mga Bisaya. Sa baboy, dahil kailangan nila ng mag-alaga ng baboy para sa dagdag na income, o baka. At gayon din, nakatali din sila sa gawaing bukid dahil kailangan nilang tumulong doon sa gawain. Kaya multitask talaga ang ginagampanan ng mga kababaihan. Pero yung kanyang ginagawa ay hindi napapahalagahan. Kahit sa statistics ay hindi mo makita ang malaking bahagi ng populasyon sa kanayunan ng mga magbubukid na kababaihan. Bagamat sinasabi natin na 60% ng population sa kanayunan ay mga kababaihang mga pesante. Kaya ang mga kababaihang pesante rin ang siyang palagi na lang humahanap ng diskarte para sa pangangailangang pang-araw-araw ng kanilang ng pamilya. At gayon din ay sila yung nangungutang sa pangangailangan para sa paggastos sa kanilang pagsasaka at iba pang mga pangangailangan sa kanilang tahanan. Gayon din sila yung apektado ng mga ilang batas na inaakala ng gobyerno na pabor para sa mga kababaihan, pero malaking problema para sa mga kababaihan yung lalo na yung no birthing at home. Hindi ka na pwedeng manganak doon sa bahay na kahit midwife or trained hilot ay hindi na pwedeng magpaanak sa bahay at nire-restrict na ito. Gayon din yung mga kababaihan na kung saan ay sa paghahanap ng iba't ibang mga trabaho at iba pang mapagkakakitaan ay dumaranas ng mga ilang sexual exploitation, lalo na doon sa kanilang mga pinagkakautangan kapag hindi na sila makabayad doon sa kanilang pinagkakautangan. Kailangang magbigay sila ng sexual favor doon sa ilan ng mga abusado, no? At gayon at kung wala na talaga silang masusulingan, at ganun din sila din ay pumapasok na katulong or kung anong pa mang trabahong doon sa pinagkakautangan nila, maging labandera, kusinera o kung ano pa man. Para sa mga kababaihan, ang mga kababaihang pesante, napakahalaga ng lupa, no? Na kung saan ay dumaranas sila kung ang mga kalalakihang magsasaka ay walang sariling lupa, lalo na ang mga kababaihang magsasaka. Dahil sa yung maraming land reform program, pero konti lang ang mga kababaihan na nabigyan talaga o naging bahagi doon sa land reform program. Kalimitan, ang titulo ay nakapangalan sa kanilang asawa at married to lang. Halimbawa, yung titulong ito ay para kay Juan at married to Maria. Kaya pag naghiwalay na sila, ang kapangyarihan ay nandoon sa mga kalalakihan. Yung lupa ay nandoon sa lalaki. At gayon din, sa mga decisions making, within the community, active na active ang mga kababaihan sa pagdalo sa mga pulong na ipinapatawag ng mga iba't ibang ahensya ng gobyerno o kung ano pa man. Pero sa oras ng pagdidesisyon at ilang mga mahalagang pulong na, ay hindi na sila makapag-decide. Ang asawa na nila ang kailangan dumalo. Kaya ito ay isang malaking disadvantage din para sa mga ilang kababaihan. Sa panahon ng nitong pandemya, lalo nang lumaganap din yung, bagamat matagal nang nangyayari yung mga land grabbings, sa panahon ng pandemya ay nagpatuloy pa rin yung mga pang-aagaw ng lupa sa kanila, na kung saan ay naipakita ng mga kababaihan na sila yung nasa frontline talaga para sa pagtatanggol sa kanilang lupang sinasaka. Kasi kung lalaki ang haharap sa mga goons o security guards at mga militar o pulis na nagsisikap na nagpipilit na pumasok sa kanilang lupain para bakuran yung mga lupa nilang sinasaka, ay yung mga mga kababaihan ng nandiyan dahil natatakot sila na ang mga kalalakihan ay mas magkakasakitan lang or pwedeng patayin ng mga armadong grupo na ito na nangangamkam ng lupa ang kanilang mga asawa. Kaya napatunayan ito doon sa mga sa Hacienda Yulo, no, sa Kanlubang, gayon din yung Lupang Ramos, no, sa Cavite, gayon din yung sa Bataan na kung saan ay panahon ng pandemya nakapagbakod yung mga land grabber dahil hindi makalabas ng komunidad yung mga magsasaka. Gayon din yung sa Bulacan at sa iba't ibang parte pa, lalo na sa Negros kung saan ay bahagi na nga ng mga pang-aagaw ng lupa. Kaya dahil sa kahalagahan ng lupa para sa mga magsasaka na kababaihan, tinitingnan namin na ang lupa ay buhay. Kung kaya't kailangan namin na magsikap na paunlarin ang aming pagsasaka. Kung kaya't kasama at aktibo ang mga kababaihan sa mga bungkalan na inilulunsad sa iba't ibang panig ng ating bansa sa Pilipinas. Nakipaglaban ang mga kababaihan at ipinagtatanggol nila yung kanilang lupang sinasaka dahil kahit na sinasabi nila na oo, hindi amin itong lupa na ito, pero tiwangwang itong mga lupain na ito at gusto lang naming pakinabangan. Hindi namin inaangkin ang lupa, pero kailangan mapakinabangan ito. Kung kaya't kailangan lumahok ang mga kababaihan sa bungkalan. At nakita namin na kapag aktibo ang mga kababaihan sa bungkalan, ay ang nananatiling maunlad din ang mga communal gardens or yung bungkalan na kanilang sinasaka. Tapos, yun, tuloy-tuloy ang kanilang pagsisikap na mapaunlad ito dahil malaki ang kanilang pakinabang. Sa panahon ng pandemya nga ay nakita nila na yung kanilang mga pananim ay nakatulong ng husto para ma-survive yung kanilang mga pagkain pangangailangan dahil sa kulang na kulang nga yung rasyon na ibinibigay sa kanila ng gobyerno. Next slide. Yung pagtatanggol ng mga kababaihan doon sa kanilang mga kabuhayan, sa kanilang paninirahan at sa kanilang mga bungkalan ay tinapatan naman ng pasistang atake ng gobyernong Duterte. Kung kaya't nandiyan yung maramihang pagpaslang, no? Nandiyan yung yung pagpaslang kay Randall Etchanis na isa sa mga consultant ng NDF na nanguna doon sa pagdadraft ng CASER, ng Comprehensive Agreement on Socio-Economic Reforms, na kung pinag-usapan ng gobyerno, nakapag-usap ang gobyerno sa NDF at hinarap itong usapin na ito, ay malaking tulong sana para sa matigil yung armadong labanan na nangyayari o ma-minimize at gayon din ay malutas talaga yung pangunahing problema ng mga magsasaka. Kaya sa ilalim ni Pangulong Duterte, 42 peasant women ang na-EJK, no, na naging biktima. Kung kaya't naging aktibo ang amihan sa mga pagkilos at mga panawagan, mga pagmobilisasyon, pakikipag-dialogue at mga iba't ibang rally na kinakailangan para mapigilan itong mga pandarahas na ito. At gayon din yung aming malakas na panawagan na ibasura yung anti-terror law at kung saan ay malaki ang kinakailangan. So, okay. Next. So, Yun, ang mga nakulong na mga kababaihan ay 63 out of 80 sa ilalim ni Pangulong Duterte. Kung kaya't dahil dito ay naglunsad kami ng binuo namin yung Defend Peasant Women campaign na kung saan ay nananawagan na itigil ang militarisasyon at gayon din ay kailangan mapigilan ang pandarahas na ginagawa ng gobyernong ito. Gayon din na yung freezing of account ng Amihan na kung saan ay pinagbintangan kami na nagfi-finance daw ng terorismo na kung saan ay walang due process, agad-agad na i-freeze ng naamlak ang aming ang dalawang bank account namin. At dahil dito patuloy ang aming pagkilos dahil kailangan kami bilang mga kababaihan ay tumututol sa mga neoliberal policies ng gobyerno, gayon din yung mga yung rice, lalong-lalo na yung rice liberalization law at yung liberalisasyon sa agrikultura, sapagkat ang mga kababaihan ay mga food security frontliners din. Kaya't ang aming panawagan ay palayain ang mga bilanggong politikal. Kaya dahil nga sa maraming red tagging, mga harassment sa aming mga kababaihan, mga leader namin, nandiyan yung aming pagsisikap na ikampanya ito ng husto. Kaya't nananawagan kami ng suporta para dito. Kaya't next, yung panawagan namin sa ano na ito ay ipatupad yung tunay na reforma. Pinapakita lang dito yung mga dating leader, yung mga leader namin ng mga nire-red tag at mga ikulong at yung iba ay pinaslang. Yung panawagan namin na free land distribution ngayon na, gayon din yung pagpapatupad ng tunay na reforma sa lupa at pambansang industrialisasyon. Next slide. Na kung saan ay panawagan naming mahigpit at gayon din yung mga pagbabasura ng mga iba't iba pang mga batas na kung saan ay apektado ang mga kababaihan. At justice for all victims of human rights violations, stop killing farmers, free all political prisoners, lalong-lalo na yung mga kababaihan, defend peasant women, stop militarization now, junk rice liberalization, Duterte, wakasan na. Maraming salamat at magandang umagang muli sa inyo.
Thank you so much, Kazen. Really appreciate you being here and sharing that with us. I think it's just so important that for each of these groups, we recognize the significance that each of these groups brings to the table, that you have the Philippines as a rice-growing country who exports rice, and not for no reason, but as a result of policies that have been put in place to take away markets from farmers. You have, as Kapando told us, a fishing country that imports fish and imports rice. So you have markets that are no longer available to farmers. And on top of that, farmers who are advocating and have been for decades to just have basic access to be able to own lands rather than just be the tillers, to be able to have sovereignty over their waters rather than to be able to go out and fish and fear that encroachment from foreign powers will mean that they are at risk of violence or will not be able to sustain their livelihoods. That these are really basic rights that farmers, fisherfolk, and especially peasant women are facing, as women always doubly oppressed on top of all those other issues. And so it's so important that we recognize that each of these groups are bringing a different lens to the table, but that the issue at the end of the day is the same, which is recognizing basic sovereignty, returning the capacity for food sovereignty to the people, that should not be in the hands of foreign governments, of foreign powers. It shouldn't be lorded over them by a regime that's interested in holding on to power. without any concern for the people's livelihoods. So with that, we should usher in the next generation, which would be the youth activists who are also so vital in the struggle that it's so important that the youth take up the torch and that they're the next generation who are fighting for genuine agrarian reform. On that front, we're going to introduce Bianca de la Cruz from NNARA Youth. NNARA Youth is a mass organization that brings together youth, students, and young professionals under the banner of genuine agrarian reform. And we want to introduce Bianca and give the floor over to you to tell us about the struggles for youth and especially Indigenous youth in this movement.
Okay, thank you so much, Justin, for the introduction. Can you hear me? Am I clear?
Hear you loud and clear.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, greetings of solidarity to all who are joining us. My name is Bianca. I'm from NNARA Youth. I'm supposed to give a brief presentation on the current situation of the rural and indigenous youth, particularly the LUMAD group. For this, I'll be talking about the Philippine context shared by both sectors of youth, the immediate threats in relation to what was already discussed by the speakers before me, and finally, the situation at present and the youth in the national struggle. So to begin, while the rural and LUMAD youth come from distinct sectors, they share very salient conditions. Both the rural and the LUMAD youth are among the country's most marginalized peoples. The majority of both lack access to basic social services, including health, education, and everyday utilities like water and electricity. This is explained partially by their geographic distance from the urban centers or local metropoles servicing capitalist cores. But more importantly, both rural and LUMAD youth share being born into groups with the most grounded, organic, and vital relationship with land and soil. Farmers and indigenous peoples who usually also farm, maintain, cultivate, and make productive use of the land. And so necessarily, in the semi-colonial, semi-feudal Philippine context, both are born into this most crucial struggle for land as the main component of an anti-imperialist struggle for social liberation and national democracy. Briefly, in two ways, the struggle for land could mean, first for the rural youth, of course, confronting generational landlessness. They would inherit or are already part of the 90% landless farmer statistic. The absence of genuine agrarian reform in the country actually means there are less and less lands institutionally protected, guaranteed, or assured for the productive use of the country's farmers and food producers, and more of it are sold off, converted, and developed. On the other hand, the struggle of the LUMAD for their ancestral land is in the context of their being driven to reside in even more remote areas like the mountains, if not completely fleeing from their own ancestral domains to survive the onslaught of multinational mining and logging companies tapping into their soil. So although not completely identical, both youth groups face threats to life and violations of their human rights that are distinctly tied to the matter of land struggle. On the ground, the rural and LUMAD youth's everyday experience is aggravated by intensifying militarization in their areas and increasingly systematic forms of persecution by the colonial state. Under the Duterte regime, there are the military-heavy Memorandum Order number 32, the Executive Order 70, which institutionalized an offensive whole-of-nation approach and created the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or NTF-ELCA, who is at the forefront of red tagging unarmed civilians, activists, indigenous peoples, farmers, workers, and unionists that lead to illegal arrests and even death. And the recently passed anti-terror law, all of which are part of the state's mechanism to criminalize dissent and wipe out the people's democratic movement. All of these afflict rural and lumad youth, particularly in three ways, namely in terms of their safety, organization, and education. In pursuit of education, for example, during this time of the pandemic in the countryside, the sudden shift to online or remote modular learning meant that most peasant families who are already deep in debt to produce food will have to seek other sources of income to acquire learning materials, if only to keep their children in school. In reality, the neoliberal education system simply disregards the material conditions in the countryside, where much youth are forced to stop schooling or would need to seek jobs as minors. Intensified militarization also means a closer threat and intimidation for rural youth. So in a series of orchestrated raids last October 2019, for example, we saw the mass arrests of 56 activists in Negros Island, including youth peasant advocate Karina de la Serna, who is among those who remain illegally detained today. For the Lumad youth, who have long been deprived of education and other social services by the state, they wage an exceptional struggle for education in the form of organizing and establishing alternative learning community schools with curricula especially designed to focus on addressing their community's needs and preserving cultural practices. These organized efforts, however, are met by attacks such as forced closures, demolition, military encampments in and around community schools, and even bombings that are perpetrated by state forces. Linking these alternative learning systems to communist insurgency, Lumads seeking refuge from violence move to urban areas to continue schooling and organization, but even these schools in central cities are hunted down, such as the quote-unquote rescue operation conducted by the police in a university in Cebu last February, forcefully taking in 26 Lumad youth and elders and volunteer teachers into their custody, even though the Buckwheat School was coordinated with the university administration. Even more recently, just last 15th of June, in fact, in the name of education and pursuing this education, a Lumad minor, si Angel Rivas, who was harvesting abaca to earn some money to support her distance and modular learning, was killed, was gunned down by the Philippine Army with two other members of the Lumad Manobo tribe in broad daylight, and was tagged as a child soldier. This massacre in Surigao del Sur alarmingly follows more targeted gruesome killings, threats, and intimidation of Lumad and indigenous leaders and activists in increasing systematic attacks against their communities and schools under the Duterte regime. So in the face of all this, the youth persist and move forward. Organization gains strength among young peoples across the countryside and the urban areas who are roused by the conditions of life under a fascist regime, even worsened by its national pandemic response. With all that has been said by the members of this panel, it's clear whose class interests are protected under this administration. At this point, I'd like to re-emphasize the indispensable participation and mobilization of young people across sectors in forming a broad network of solidarity with the peasant class and in carrying the banner for land struggle and raising the call for land security for the overwhelming majority of the Filipino people, there will be no genuine liberation from the yoke of imperialism, colonialism, and racism that afflict every Filipino. Our call for the youth is to join the struggle for land. So tunay na reforma sa lupa, ipaglaban. Thank you for having us join this platform.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Really appreciate you being here. And yeah, just wanted to point out again that landlessness has such an intergenerational tether and component that you can see as the government has an intention to divorce people from the land further and further, to divide them violently from their connection to the land. And that plays out especially among the youth who might be growing up further disconnected from the capacity to have a healthy working relationship with the land. And so I think to make sure that the youth have a central place in the struggle is so key for anything that has the power for radical revolutionary change. Now we want to shift into another performance that we have recorded from SINAGBAYAN. This is Dapat Bawiin, or It Must Be Reclaimed. It's an original song by Nueva Canción that was adapted by Patatag, which is a cultural group in the Philippines formed in 1984. They created progressive music that expresses the needs and aspirations of the masses. And this song asserts that the land must be reclaimed and owned by those who till it. The second song in the video is entitled Hindi Ko Kayo Titigilan, or I Will Not Stop Hounding You, from the peace advocate and people's martyr, rest in power, Ka Randy Ichanis. Adrian, if you could play those.
Land to the tillers. Long live international solidarity.
Hindi mo ba naiisip
That was incredible. I just, yeah, I want to listen to those again. That was beautiful. And just another appreciation to SINAGBAYAN for putting those together. And we'll make sure that you all have access to those and that they're available for you all. We're running a little behind, so we've got a compressed period where we're going to try to fit in some questions and answers, hopefully. We have 2 questions currently in the chat, so I think if we can cover those, and if anyone else has any further questions, you can add those to the Q&A section or to the chat, and we'll try to respond in a post-broadcast email that will follow up with the full attendee list. So Nina, can I introduce you to handle delegating these 2 questions?
Yes, thank you. So thank you to all of our speakers, Growing Culture, and all attendees for making this possible today. We heard about the national situation in the Philippines, the conditions of peasants in the Philippines, and from the different perspectives of various sectors. So now we're just going to go into Q&A. So if people have some additional questions, feel free to pop them in now. So as a reminder for our panelists, kung sasagot po kayo sa Tagalog, pakisabi na lang po sa amin para maihanda namin ang audience at interpreters. Please speak in Tagalog so we can warn our audience and interpreters to switch channels. The first question we have here, I'll direct to any of the speakers. What are the impacts of climate change on peasants and fisher folks?
Malaki yung malaki yung epekto sa hanay ng mga magbubukid ng climate change dahil sa hindi na namin malaman ngayon kung kailan ba talaga ang taniman, kasi yung ulan hindi na, dati June uulan na, May, June tagtaniman na, ganyan. Pero ngayon hindi mo na ma-predict kung ano na yung mga ulan at tag-init, sobrang init at minsan naman ay sobrang ulan na siyang nakakasira ng mga pananim at nalulugi yung mga magsasaka dito sa ganitong kalagayan. Mahirap din para sa mga kababaihan dahil yung tubig na kailangan sa pang-araw-araw ay dahil sa mga pagkakalbo ng mga bundok, pagmimina at mga iba't iba pang mga pagsira sa kalikasan ay nawawala yung mga tubig na mga bukal na pinagkukunan ng na pangangailangan nila sa inumin at mga pang-araw-araw na gamit sa kanilang tahanan. At gayon din yung pangangailangan sa bukid. Kaya ayun, malaking epekto para sa mga hanay ng mga magsasaka at mga kababaihan.
Okay, magandang umaga.
Hello.
Hello.
Sige. Kapandoy, ikaw muna.
Ako muna. Sige.
Sige.
Kaugnay dun sa tanong, no? Ano yung epekto ng climate change sa mga mangingisda at pangisdaan? Actually, yung mga mangingisda po yung vulnerable, no? At sila yung nakakaranas talaga ng epekto ng pagbabago ng klima o ng climate change. Isa na dyan yung kapag mayroong masamang panahon, malalakas na bagyo, ay nasisira yung kanilang mga komunidad, no? At naandyan din kapag mayroong mga mining sa bundok kung saan nasa baba, nasa coastal area yung mga komunidad ng mga mangingisda ay apektado rin sa mga landslide, flooding, kung saan ay natatabunan yung mga mangroves area at saka mga corals sa mga tabing dagat, no? Ang mga particular na karanasan natin yan dito sa Pilipinas, yung isang isla, sa yung Lapayit Mining Corporation sa Rapu-Rapu Albay, no? Hanggang ngayon, mula pa noong 2005, no, nagkaroon ng bagyo at nawas out yung kanilang mine filling at napunta doon sa dagat. Hanggang ngayon ay hindi pa nakaka-recover yung pangisdaan, no? Namatay yung mga corals sa tabunan at hindi na nabubuhay yung mga isda at kontaminado na ng mga iba't ibang chemicals, no? Yung ating dagat. At nandiyan din, nararanasan na rin yung mga pagputi o pagkamatay ng mga corals, no? Dahil sa sobrang init. Pagtaas ng tubig, dati-dati yung mga komunidad ng mga mangisda ay hindi inaabot anumang high tide, pero regular high tide lang ay inaabot na o mababa na yung komunidad ng mga mangisda. Ang isa sa mga dahilan diyan kung bakit gano'n ang naging sitwasyon na, no, na vulnerable na nga, mas lalong naging vulnerable dito sa climate change dahil nga doon sa hirapan. Una, yung mga bahay ng mga mangisda ay nasa coastal area at mga light materials lamang ang gamit, no, ng kanilang bahay, kaya mabilis na masira at wala silang safety at wala talagang tugon ng gobyerno para magkaroon ng evacuation na safety yung mga mangisda sa komunidad. Bagkus, ang naging tugon pa ng gobyerno, no, yung pagpapailis, no, yung noble zone, no, dwelling zone policy sa mga coastal area na kung saan ay pinagbabawalan na tumira yung mga mangisdang Pilipino sa mga baybaying dagat from 40 meters to 200 meters. Kaya ibig sabihin, nagamit pa, no, itong climate change, yung impact ng climate change para doon sa malawakang devolution at resettlement ng mga mangisda at mga mamayan sa mga baybaying dagat para payagan, habang sa kabilang banda ay pinapayagang itayo yung mga tourism facilities tulad ng mga hotels, mga resort, no, mga private resort. At ang pinakamatindi pa na naging vulnerable yung mga mangisda dahil doon sa pagkawasak at pagkasira ng mga mangroves area natin, dahil doon sa pagtayo ng mga fish pond at ganoon din yung mga reklamasyon sa mga baybaying dagat. Kaya sa tanong kung ano epekto, ito yung naging epekto talaga. Yung tama yun, sa mga mangisda, isa pa ring problema ngayon, yung dati-dati alam ng mga mangisda kung ganito ang panahon, ganito ang hangin, ganito yung agos ng tubig, ay alam nila kung nasaan yung isda at saan nahuhuli yung isda. Pero ngayon ay unpredictable na yung weather, no? Kaya karamihan ng mga mangisda ngayon ay nabibiktima na inaabot sa laot ng mga malalakas na alon o malalakas na hangin, no, dahil dito sa climate change. Kaya ang ano namin diyan, ang isa sa mitigation sana dapat talaga mga reforestation, tapos yung mangrove reforestation ibalik sa dati, yung mga coastal area para doon sa pagtatanim ng mangrove, at tutulan at labanan, itigil na yung lahat ng mapanirang mga proyekto na sumisira sa mga coastal area at pangisdaan natin, na lalong naging vulnerable sa epekto ng climate change, lalo na kung mayroong mga masamang panahon tulad ng mga reklamasyon. Dito po sa Pilipinas, sa ilalim ng administrasyon ni Pangulong Duterte ay napakaraming reklamasyon, no? Dito 100 reclamation project yan at marami dyan yung mga aprobado na. Ang isa sa pinakamalaki at aprobado na at meron ng approve ng franchise law sa Kongreso at Senado at pirmado ni Pangulong Duterte sa loob lamang ng September to December ay yung Aerotropolis na 2,500 hektarya dyan sa Bulacan, na kung saan yung Manila Bay ay ito na lang yung natitira ng mangrove sa area ng Manila Bay. Pag natuloy ito, talagang totally ay masisira yung Manila Bay at totally ay kukulang na yung supply ng isda dyan. Kaya yun po, yun, no? Yung mga ilang mga epekto ng climate change sa pangisdaan natin at mga mamamayan na nirahan sa mga baybaying dagat. Hindi po, magandang umaga.
Hello, Nina. Si Kadaning po. Doon sa tanong, merong 4 na impact, no? Napakasamang epekto. Una, pagkasira ng mga bukirin, agricultural lands. Second, yung pagkain, no? May epekto sa pagkain para sa food security, food self-sufficiency. Third, epekto sa kapaligiran. At pang-4, ang kalusugan ng mga magsasaka at ng toiling masses. Pero mahalaga makita, bakit ba may nagkakaganyan? Gusto ko lang bigyan ng din dahil sa mapanira at mapaminsalang pagmimina sa bansa na pinapayagan ng gobyerno. Dati pa yan, yung Mining Act of 1995. Second, yung legal at saka illegal logging. Dagdag pa dyan, yung mga land use conversion at saka government policies and program na pinapatupad ng gobyerno sa ilalim ng build neoliberal policy. Yung nabanggit ko, konkretong example, nung nakaraan pong December, sa sunod-sunod na bagyo, halimbawa sa Cagayan, yung the longest river, almost 500 kilometers ng Cagayan River, na overflow, yung mga bahay ng mga magsasaka, kahit yung palay nasa loob, na-wash out. At sinabi mismo to ni Governor Mamba na ang dahilan ay mining at saka logging. Kaya merong flash flood sa Cagayan. Dagdag pa, yung plantasyon, pag-iral ng maraming plantation, lalo pa sa Mindanao, Lapanday Food Corporation, Del Monte, yung aerial spray, may malaking epekto sa kalusugan at pagkain ng ating mga kababayan. Kaya panghuli, dapat ay alisin yung pulisiya mismo ng gobyerno. Kaugnay nitong land use conversion, yung pagmimina, tapos stop mapanira at mapaminsalang pagmimina. So tapos panagutin yung may kinalaman. So yun lang po, at talagang hanggang hindi napapatupad yung genuine agri-reform and national industrialization at yung policy and program, lalo pa ngayon, patuloy ang kahirapan ng magsasaka at mamamayan. Kaya para mabago yung policies and program, dapat na talagang wakasan na ang rehimeng Duterte. Salamat po.
Yes, thank you for that summary. Salamat po sa mga sagot nyo. Very concrete examples. Just for the sake of time, we're going to move on, and we will try to cover the last question in our calls and concluding thoughts. So I'll pass it back to you, Justin.
Thank you so much, Nina, and really appreciate everyone's answers. Please, again, if you have any further questions in the chat, we can make sure we get to them in our responding email after the broadcast. I'm going to pass it on to Jill to introduce the next section. We just got a few more minutes. We don't want to hold our interpreters too long, but we want to let you all know how you can support the movement.
Yes, thanks, Justin. And I'm going to pass it on to Adrian Bonifacio, who is the chairperson of SINAGBAYAN USA, how we can support after hearing from all of our speakers and hearing about the peasant struggle. Yes, Adrian, can you share with us what are the calls to action?
Yes, thank you so much to all of our speakers who really shared the big need to support the peasant movement in the Philippines, Fishefolk communities, indigenous communities who are not just under political attacks, but economic attacks, livelihood attacks, hunger, right? And so there are a couple of different ways that we want to be able to call all of the participants here today to action, because we know that we can't just keep this information in our heads, but that we need to translate it to concrete support. And so listed here are a couple of different ways that a growing culture, Bayan USA, and our partners in the Philippines have thought that we can involve many different people here in the US, Canada. I saw there are people from Australia here in supporting the peasant movement in the Philippines. So the first one for those based in the United States is to endorse the Philippine Human Rights Act. For those who may not be familiar, the Philippine Human Rights Act, or PHRA, is a piece of legislation that calls to cut all forms of US security or military aid to the Philippines until a time that the human rights violations of the Philippine military and police can be investigated. This bill was introduced in Congress last year. It was reintroduced this past, just a couple weeks ago, actually. And there are many different representatives in the US House of Representatives who are supporting it. We are really calling on your organizations, individuals to support this bill. Ask people to endorse it. You can lobby your legislators. And the reason why this is important is because it can stop the hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid going to the Philippines that is being used to attack peasant, fisherfolk communities, indigenous communities, who are all standing up for their right to till the land. All of our speakers today talked about the severe human rights violations against the peasant sector and the peasant class. And so this is a really concrete way that we can take action to cut that aid. Another one is to donate to the Defend Filipino Farmers campaign. We'll drop the link in the chat, but this is something that you can do direct financial donations to help with the different campaigns that Pamalakaya, KMP, Amihan, NNARA Youth, and others were talking about today. We know that the economic situation in the Philippines is very dire, and that the organizers there are doing all they can with very little resources. So any support we can give is much appreciated. If you want to donate directly via Venmo to Bayan USA and note peasant support, that would actually ensure that no transaction fees are taken from your donation. So, and we'll, as Bayan USA, we'll make sure that that donation goes directly to KMP. Another thing that you can do is to sign on to the Defend the West Philippine Sea sign-on letter that we shared in the chat after Kapando shared on the situation of fisherfolk, especially in the West Philippine Sea. This is something that is really crucial as fisherfolk are really fighting for their economic livelihood against Chinese aggression in the area. So please sign on to that letter. Another one is to attend a national summit by our partners in the Malaya movement. The Malaya movement is a national organization and alliance fighting against fascism and dictatorship in the Philippines. We know that from all the sharings today that Duterte is really ramping up attacks against many peasant leaders. And so this summit will be an opportunity to bring together people across the United States. If you're in different countries, feel free to join as well, and unite us in how are we going to learn about the campaigns and work that we need to do together to fight fascism. Another thing that you can do, it's listed last year, is to hold similar webinars and conversations in your own areas. Today was a great start, but we definitely want to make sure that we can echo this conversation in your cities, in your states, so that we can get more and more people involved. You know, there may be specific corporate entities or academic institutions in your own backyard that could be contributing to displacement, to neoliberal research or policies, or other things that are directly impacting peasant and fisherfolk communities. And we'd want to engage as many people as possible by knowing how people in your own cities can be involved. And speaking of that, the last thing here is to join or volunteer for an organization fighting for the rights of peasants in the Philippines. And so there's a bit.ly link there that we'll drop in the chat as well. And we will ensure that you can get connected to organizers. There's a lot of different ways that you can get involved. You can join an organization that's fighting for peasant rights in the Philippines. You can volunteer skills. If you're already part of an organization, we'd love to work with you on specific projects. You could create art or media about the different causes you've heard today. You can continue to donate. And all of this is really so that we can build the broadest movement possible to defend and support peasant farmers in the Philippines. And many of the speakers today were mentioning the call to end the Duterte regime. Duterte wakasan na. It is a movement that we are trying to definitely build here in the United States as well, by building as much support as we can to end the fascist Duterte regime and the attacks on peasant farmers and the economic attacks that are causing hunger for the majority of the Filipino people. And so please save this link, screenshot it right now. We'll send it in a follow-up email afterwards. But these are just a few ways you can support. And if you have any other ideas, please let us know and we'd be happy to talk them through and collaborate together.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm just going to say a few thoughts, and then if Jill has any last thoughts, we can close things out officially. I think it's important to recognize that the Duterte regime has worked very hard so that general audiences, when they look at the speakers, the powerful human rights leaders that we've had in this panel, they want the public to see them as terrorists. They don't want them to see them as the people who are leading the masses towards a future that includes dignified livelihoods, land, and justice. And I think it's really important that that we don't get bogged down by the darkness and the violence and the things that are happening, but that we remember that we need to be turning to the movements who have been doing this work for decades. We need to come together. If you are a part of a movement, if you want to volunteer your time or energy or resources to any of these movements, please do. The time is never better than now. There's so much need, and we all need our movements to be coming together if we want to have the chance for a truly revolutionary change in the future. So we need to be seeing each other as comrades and kin, bringing together our peasants, indigenous, and fisher folk brothers and sisters. And so I'll just leave you with that we're here to collaborate, and just so grateful to everyone, the interpreters, the speakers, all you tuning in. Thank you so much for being here. Jill, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I appreciation to all around. Thank you again. Yeah, to all our speakers and the interpreters, to a growing culture, to this mass movement we're building together. And of course, it's not going to end here. We have so much more to do. We're going to do our part to support the peasant struggle. This is just the beginning, if not a long road to victory, right? So we're going to close out this webinar, but again, these conversations will continue. Folks know isang baksak, which means one down, one step closer to victory, to our communities and our people, being free. So here in the Northwest, we like to rub our hands together. And when I call isang baksak, we all clap in unison because we're together in this movement. So isang baksak. Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.